Welcome to the Duchess Drawing Room, where love is always worth the scandal. I'm your host, the Duchess, and today we are diving into a Regency romance that will absolutely ruin you in the best possible way. This is the tale of a woman who made herself invisible for 4 years to expose the worst of society, and the Duke who saw through every layer of ash, every facade, every carefully constructed wall, and chose her anyway. It's a story about what happens when the one person you never planned for looks at the disguise you built to keep the world out and decides that whoever is underneath it is worth £5,000 and every Tuesday midnight for the rest of his life. So settle in, dear readers. Pour your tea, close the door, and relax. I promise you, by the time we reach the last word, you will feel every single page of it. Now, let the story begin.
The candle had burned down to nothing by the time she heard the footsteps outside her door. Vivienne Ashby did not move. She sat at the edge of the bed in William Cavendish guest wing, still wearing the blue gown, and still wearing her real face, the sapphire ring catching the last gasp of candlelight from the table beside her. The footsteps passed. A servant, nothing more. She let out a long sigh, yet her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from something far more inconvenient than fear. She looked at the ring, then looked at the mirror across the room. Her reflection stared back at her. Loose auburn hair, amber eyes too bright, looking like a woman who had just done something irreversible and was not yet certain whether it was the bravest or the most catastrophic thing she had ever done. Both, she mumbled softly to herself. Probably both. She pressed her palm flat against the bedsheet, feeling the ring's edge against her finger. It had a strange weight. A real weight, unlike anything she had ever felt. From downstairs, through 2 floors of Ashford House, she could hear him. She couldn't for the life of her hear the actual words he spoke, just his voice. Low and measured. It seemed he was speaking to someone, his butler, likely. It was the sound of a man who had just changed his entire life and was handling the household correspondence anyway, because that was who William Cavendish was. She almost smiled, then immediately caught herself, but ended up smiling anyway. This was her life now. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the ring, before the blue gown, before the carriage and the masquerade, and the £5,000 that stopped an entire room, there was a mirror in a lodging house on the wrong side of Mayfair, and a girl turning herself into a complete nobody.
Before we move on with our beautiful story, I would love you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs a good story, because we are just getting warmed up. Now, back to the story.
Vivienne had a system. It had taken 3 months to perfect and 4 years to make automatic. First, the powder. She mixed it herself, ash and chalk and a particular grey pigment her uncle's printer used, rubbed into her skin in slow, methodical circles until the warmth of her complexion disappeared entirely. Then the wig, dull brown, aggressively limp, pinned so tightly against her scalp that by the end of an evening her head ached. Then the corset, stuffed at the sides until her silhouette became something formless and vaguely tragic. The gown was, and always had been, beige. It was the color of wallpaper, the color of a woman who had surrendered. Finally, the hunch. Shoulders forward, chin down, eyes slightly too eager in the desperate way that made men look away in second-hand embarrassment. She looked at the mirror. Miss Maud Greywell looked back. Plain. Forgettable. Utterly invisible. Good, Vivienne thought. She picked up the small leather notebook from the dressing table, pressed it flat against her thigh beneath her skirts where no one would see it, and went to work. The auction hall smelled of expensive cologne and quiet cruelty. It always did. This was her 4th year walking through its doors, and she had long stopped being disturbed by how ordinary it looked. There were chandeliers, fresh flowers, women in their best gowns arranged like inventory along the walls, some of them young enough that it turned her stomach. Men in masks moving through the room with paddles tucked under their arms, speaking to each other about horses and hunting, and occasionally, almost as an afterthought, pointing at a woman the way one might point at a piece of furniture. Vivienne took her chair at the far corner. It was always the same chair, the one with the cracked gilt arm and the partially obstructed sightline that no one else ever wanted. She smoothed her skirts, accepting the warm champagne from a passing footman. Yet, she did not drink it. Instead, She pressed it close to her lips as she watched everything unfold as it usually did. Lord Fenwick was near the fireplace, and even from here she could see the way the woman beside him had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She'd simply stopped, like a music box winding down, when he turned his attention elsewhere. Vivienne's thumbnail pressed into the cover of her notebook. Clara had stopped writing letters in October. Not because she was busy, or because she was happy, because Clara Fenwick, née Hartley, had learned that silence was safer than words when you lived with a man like that. Vivienne had learned that too. She had learned it and then decided, with the cold fury of someone who had nowhere useful to aim their grief, to become the most dangerous kind of silent, the kind that watched and remembered, then eventually published all their dirty little secrets. Her pen moved. Small, quick strokes. Lord Fenwick's knuckles, white around his paddle. The way he gestured twice tonight toward Lady Marston as though appraising livestock. Written. Lord Pemberton, 2 chairs down, who had told the auctioneer last season that he wanted someone biddable, not clever. He'd gone ahead to then bid on, and subsequently broken the spirit of a perfectly intelligent girl from Somerset named Frances, who now sat in his drawing room with the expression of someone who had locked a door inside themselves and swallowed the key. Vivienne had written it all down. Then there was Lord Carroway, who hadn't done anything tonight except exist with the specific arrogance of a man who had never once been told no, and who Vivienne had been building a case against for 3 months on the basis of 6 independently corroborated accounts and 1 extremely incriminating financial document her uncle's contact had acquired through means she hadn't asked about. Such a scandal practically wrote itself. She was halfway through a notation on Lord Rowe when the room changed. She felt it before she saw it, the particular shift in the air of a crowd when something enters that it doesn't know how to categorize. A ripple of turned heads, starting from the entrance and moving through the room like a stone dropped in still water. The whispers arrived at her corner before anything else did. "Who is that?" came a voice. "I don't think I know him," came another. "Does anyone know him?" Yet another voice asked. Vivienne did not look up. Looking up was how you became visible, and she was never visible. But the whispers kept coming, and underneath them she heard something else, the particular silence of a room that has stopped laughing, which was more alarming than any noise. She finally looked up. He was standing at the entrance in a charcoal coat that needed nothing added to it, and he was masked like all of them, but where other men wore their masks as costume, his mask sat like armor. He was tall and still and golden-haired in a way that the candlelight seemed to have specifically arranged itself to accommodate, and he was doing something that no one else in this room had done all evening. He was looking for someone. Not performing the search, or making an entrance. Actually, purposefully, with those dark eyes moving through the crowd with quiet and methodical attention. His gaze landed on her corner. Vivienne dropped her eyes immediately. An old reflex she'd been cultivating. A safe reflex, if you may. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. The auction began. And the auctioneer moved through the early numbers with his usual smooth efficiency. Bids began being placed, and women were acquired, while Vivienne sat in her cracked chair and pressed her thumbnail into her notebook and told herself firmly that whatever she'd felt was irrelevant and she had work to do. The auctioneer called her number. Silence. The usual silence. 10 full seconds of it, the 10 seconds she'd sat through a dozen times, the 10 seconds that confirmed her invisibility was holding. £1,000, came a deep voice. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. It was the silence of 100 people simultaneously losing the ability to process what they'd just heard. Vivienne felt it land. She felt every head in the room turn, and for one very long second she sat completely still, certain she had misheard, certain this was some mistake. She finally forced herself to look up and search for this person who had actually bid on her. His paddle was still raised, and he was looking directly at her, not at the room, not performing for an audience, right at her, with an expression she couldn't read from this distance except to say that it was entirely, disturbingly serious. Going once, the auctioneer managed to say after a short few seconds of shock. £5,000. The man said again, changing his starting bid. Someone dropped a glass. She heard it distantly, the way you hear things when your blood has forgotten how to circulate properly. The laughter started at the edges of the room, nervous, confused, the tongue's knee-jerk response to anything it couldn't categorize, and she felt the heat of it find her face, 50 pairs of eyes landing on Maud Greywell, with the bewildered pity of people watching something impossible. Why her? Why that much? Is it a joke? Is he mad? Why is he walking toward? He was walking toward her, through the parted crowd, unhurried, and the laughter died as he moved because there was nothing in his posture that invited it, and people who might have laughed found themselves, inexplicably, not. He stopped before her, extended his hand, and said, quietly, close enough that the words existed only between them in the midst of all that noise, "I read your articles, and 3 men in this room have paid someone to make sure you never write another one. Please take my hand." She looked at his hand. Long, steady fingers. She looked at his mask. Dark eyes behind it, watching her without urgency, without performance, just waiting. She looked at the crowd behind him. She looked at Lord Fenwick near the fireplace, who had gone very still. At Lord Pemberton, whose eyes had narrowed in a way that confirmed everything this stranger had just told her. At Lord Carroway, who was already leaning toward the man beside him, whispering. 4 years. Perfect control. Never once caught. And all that ad ended in the blink of an eye. She slowly took his hand. His name was William Cavendish. She learned this the way you learn things in a crisis, in fragments, between trying to determine whether you just made the best or worst decision of your life. Duke of Ashford. 31. No wife. No scandal. No documented history of attending auctions. He gave her none of this in the carriage. He gave her silence, which was somehow worse, because it was not hostile silence or uncomfortable silence but the silence of a man who had said what needed saying and was now simply present, which she found she had no protocol for. She was angled against the far door with her hands in her lap, still moored, still grey, still hunched, watching him through the limited candlelight of a moving carriage. He was looking out the window. "How long have you known?" she found herself asking. He turned to her slowly. "About the men?" he asked. "Since this morning." "Not them," she corrected. "I meant about me." There was a short pause, precise and deliberate, the pause of a man carefully choosing his next words. "Long enough," he finally answered. Her thumbnail found her notebook through the fabric of her skirt. "That isn't an answer." "No," he agreed. "It really isn't." She looked at him, and he looked back. Outside, London moved past, lamplight and cobblestones and the ordinary noise of a city that had no idea what was happening in this particular carriage. "You don't need to stay," he said. "At the house. I'll have someone take you wherever you need to go." But those men, Fenwick, Pemberton, Carroway, they had someone at the auction tonight. Paid, prepared, and waiting for a bid that never came, but only because I got there first. "You're safe now. You'll be safer still if you come to Ashford House, at least until we know how much they know." She sat with that for a moment. The specificity of it, Fenwick, Pemberton, Carroway, not guesses but names, 3 names she knew in her own bones, told her this man had sources that ran deeper than a morning's intelligence. "Why?" she said. "Why what?" he asked. "Why come at all? Why spend £5,000 on a woman you don't know to save her from men you have no obligation to oppose?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have every obligation." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned back to the window. And Vivienne, who prided herself on reading people, found she could not read him, not yet, and filed that fact somewhere uncomfortable to revisit later. The carriage stopped. Ashford House rose above them, tall and settled and dark-windowed in the way of houses that had decided long ago they had nothing to prove. He stepped out, offered his hand again. "The door is never locked," he said. "My house. My rules. You leave whenever you choose." She looked at his hand for the second time that night. And she took it for the second time that night. But what she didn't tell him, what she folded carefully away in the part of herself she never showed anyone, was that when his hand had closed around hers in that auction room and he'd said please, the particular way he'd said it, not commanding and not pleading but simply honest, something had happened to her composure that she would be needing some time to address. Later. She would address it later. She followed him inside. She had prepared for a transaction. She was given, instead, a chair. Dinner, the first night, was not what she expected. It wasn't formal, neither was it strained, and definitely not the performance of 2 strangers being civilized at each other across a long table. It was almost aggressively ordinary. He was already seated when she came down, still moored, still everything in place, braced for the polite inquiry into her health and the careful management of her presence. He was reading a letter and frowning at it, and when she sat down he looked up and said without preamble, "What do you know about the Bexley Act?" She blinked, a bit shocked. "The parliamentary amendment?" she asked. "It failed in committee 3 weeks ago." "It was killed in committee," he said. "There's a difference. Someone paid to have it killed." She looked at him, and he looked back at her. The footman appeared and poured tea, no sugar in hers, yet she hadn't said anything about sugar to anyone. She immediately tried to dismiss it as irrelevant. "How do you know it was paid for?" she ended up asking. "Because I've seen the ledger." "Whose ledger?" Her voice chirped up almost immediately. His jaw tightened once. "That's the question, isn't it?" She picked up her tea. Around them, the house was quiet. Silver on white linen. Candlelight. The specific sound of two people sitting in a room and discovering, with some wariness on both sides, that the other person was more interesting than expected. "Hargrove," she said. It wasn't a guess. William went still. "His name appears in every document trail I've followed for 3 years," she said. "Every parliamentary obstruction. Every family ruined for speaking too loudly. Every woman sold through that auction into the households of men who owed him favors." She set her cup down. "I've been saving him for last." William Cavendish looked at her for a long moment. The frown had not disappeared, but it had changed. It had become something less like frustration and more like a man recalibrating an equation. "Why last?" he said. "Because when you go for the head, you cannot miss. I needed everything else first." She met his eyes. "How close are you?" "Close," he said. "But not close enough." "Neither am I," she sighed. The candle between them burned. Outside, rain had started, quiet and persistent, against the tall windows. "You should eat," he said. "The beef is good. My cook is the one thing in this house I've managed to get exactly right." She looked at her plate. Then, because she was hungry and the beef did actually smell extraordinary, and she was not going to perform Maud's self-effacing lack of appetite when no one was watching, she ate. He went back to his letter. But she noticed, the way she noticed everything, that he read the same paragraph 3 times without turning the page. The library happened on a Tuesday. She had not planned it. She had been awake since 2, her mind moving through the Hargrove documents with the restless efficiency of a brain that refused to stop working, and the fire in the library was warm and she was cold. Also, the Voltaire on the shelf was a first edition she had wanted to argue with for years. She did not expect him to be there. He was at the far desk, elbow deep in correspondence, coat discarded, sleeves turned back, looking like a man who also could not sleep and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. He looked up when she entered. She stopped quickly. He said, "Tell me what you think of Candide." She should have said goodnight. Retreated. Maintained the careful distance of 2 people sharing a house under very unusual circumstances. Instead, she found herself sitting down in the armchair that faced the garden window. "I think Voltaire was furious," she said, "and dressed it up as philosophy so no one would see the wound underneath." He set his pen down. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about Candide," he said. "And also completely wrong." She felt something ignite in her chest, the specific heat of a good argument finding its proper kindling. "Explain yourself," she said. And that he did. But she found a way to dismantle it. William rebuilt it from a different angle. And Vivienne somehow found the flaw in the new angle. He conceded the flaw with an expression of genuine, slightly aggrieved capitulation and immediately tried a third approach, and by the time she had thoroughly defeated the third approach, it was past 2 in the morning. The fire had burned low and she had not once, in the past 3 hours, remembered to let her shoulders hunch the way Maud's always did. "You're remarkably sharp," he said. The tone of a man stating a fact. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," he said, and the simplicity of it, no performance, no flattery, just the plain statement delivered straight, did something to her that she spent the walk back to her room trying to undo. Unfortunately, she couldn't undo it. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, "This is fine. This is manageable. He is a man with a library and a cook and reasonable opinions about French philosophy. This is entirely manageable." The following Tuesday, she came to the library again. And he was already there. The armchair had been moved 6 inches to the left. The angle to the garden window was now perfect. Neither of them mentioned it. But in the silence between the crackling fire and the sound of rain, and the first opening salvo of their second argument, Vivienne Ashby understood, with the sinking clarity of someone who has just noticed a crack in a very important wall, that she was in serious, serious trouble. For weeks into living in William Cavendish house, Vivienne made a critical tactical error. She started looking forward to Tuesdays. Not in the vague, unexamined way one looks forward to a warm fire or a decent meal. In the specific, inconvenient, slightly alarming way that meant she'd caught herself on a Monday afternoon thinking about something she wanted to say to him, a rebuttal she'd been quietly constructing since the previous week, a counter-argument so precise it would make him put his pen down and look at her with those dark eyes, gone still and focused, and had only then realized what that meant. It meant Tuesday had become the fixed point she was orienting the rest of her week around. She filed this realization under unacceptable and went back to her Hargrove documents. But the documents were on the desk, and the Voltaire was on the shelf, and through the floor she could hear, faintly, the sound of him moving through the house with the unhurried purpose of a man entirely at home in his own life. And the thing about William Cavendish, the thing she had not anticipated and could not account for, was that he never performed his intelligence. He never used it to impress or intimidate or win a room. He simply thought, carefully and honestly, and told the truth of what he'd thought, while waiting for you to do the same. She had never met a man who waited. They all talked over her, talked past her. They'd use conversation as a delivery mechanism for their own opinions, pausing at intervals to let her make approving noises before continuing. She had spent years building Maud around the assumption that being unimpressive was the only safe way to exist in a room with men like that. William disagreed with her constantly, and meant every word of it, and listened to her disagree back with the attentiveness of someone who had come to the argument genuinely wanting to know what she thought. It was, she was furious to admit, the most attractive thing she had ever encountered in her life. The coat happened on a Thursday. It was a small thing. And that was the problem with all of it, it was always small things, accumulating quietly, and by the time she noticed how many there were, they had already built into something structural. They were in the drawing room after dinner, a larger gathering that evening. His friend Lord Edmund had brought 2 other gentlemen, and Vivienne had spent the first hour being gratifyingly invisible in the corner, notebook pressed to her thigh, cataloguing the particular flavor of obliviousness that came with old money and unchallenged privilege. Then someone opened the far window, and the October air came through in a cold wall, and she shivered. It was barely perceptibly, hardly noticeable. Yet she became aware of warmth across her shoulders approximately 2 seconds later, and looked down to find his coat settled there, dark wool, still carrying the warmth of him, and when she looked up he was already 3 steps away, back in the conversation he'd left, not looking at her, not waiting for acknowledgement. As if he'd simply done the obvious next thing and moved on. Lord Edmund, from across the room, caught her eye. His expression said, quite clearly, "I have known this man for 15 years and I have never seen him do that for anyone." Vivienne looked back down at her notebook. She wrote nothing for the next 20 minutes. Just sat there, in his coat, completely failing to be Maud Greywell. The argument that broke her happened on the following Tuesday, and it was, fittingly, about justice. She had made a point, a good point, an irrefutable point, about the systemic nature of what the auction perpetuated, and he had sat with it for a long moment before saying, "You're right. I've been approaching it from the architecture when the architecture is only possible because of what you've been documenting. The human cost is the foundation of the whole argument." And then he'd said, "I've been wrong about the approach for 3 years. I needed someone to say that." She had opened her mouth to respond, then immediately closed it. He'd looked at her with a slight frown, not hostile, just curious, the way he looked when something surprised him. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're just..." She stopped. "I'm just what?" "You said you were wrong," she said. "Without, you just said it. Directly." He looked genuinely puzzled. "I was wrong." "Men don't," she caught herself. "I mean, people don't generally do that." "That seems exhausting," he said. "Being wrong and having to maintain it." She looked at him. He looked back, baffled by her reaction in the honest way of someone who had no idea he was doing something extraordinary. And something happened in her chest that she could only describe as a door she hadn't known was closed swinging open in the dark. She made a joke to recover. He laughed warmly. And they moved on. But she carried that open door all the way back to her room, and she stood at the window for a long time afterward, watching the street below, and she thought about Clara Hartley and what Clara would have given to sit across a table from a man who could simply say I was wrong and mean it. She thought about herself at 19, walking into that first auction hall, fury in her chest and a plan so small and so enormous at the same time. She thought about the armchair moved 6 inches to the left. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Don't, she told herself. But it seemed it was already too late. She heard the conversation on a Friday. She was not eavesdropping at the time. She was just passing the study and the door was 3 inches ajar and Lord Edmund's voice carried into the corridor and her feet made the decision to stop entirely independently of her brain. Will, I say this with love. The wig alone. Don't, said William in a gruff voice. All I'm simply saying is that the ton is. I know what the ton is saying, Edmund. I know what everyone is saying. His voice, measured, as always, but underneath the measure was something that wasn't quite edge and wasn't quite weariness and was precisely both. I don't particularly care. You spent £5,000, Edmund cried. I'm well aware of the number. William replied calmly. For a woman no one has ever bid on. Which tells you considerably more about the room than it does about her. William said, with a quiet that somehow carried more weight than volume. Then Edmund, more carefully, I just don't want to see you regret your decision. I know. William sighed. Then Vivienne heard the sound of him standing and moving. Edmund, I have had more genuinely interesting conversations in the past 4 weeks than I have had in the past 4 years. She disagrees with me. Completely. Articulately. And with evidence. There was a small pause. Do you have any idea how rare that is? So find a clever woman who isn't. Edmund stopped, not wanting to complete his statement. But I don't want a different woman. William said, not loud. Or emphatic. Just, true, in the way things are true when a person stops managing them. I don't care what she looks like. I would bid that amount 10 times over without question. And Edmund, if she never takes that ridiculous wig off, then I will be a thoroughly contented man, he finished. So please, for the love of God, stop helping. Vivienne was already 3 steps down the corridor when her legs stopped working properly. She stood very still. The wallpaper was yellow with small ivory flowers and she stared at it with great focus, as though it might offer some kind of structural support. I don't want a different woman. She had written exposés on 12 lords. She had infiltrated the same room for 4 years without detection. She had built a second identity so complete that her own reflection had started to feel like the costume. She had prepared for every contingency except this one, except a man who looked at Maud Greywell, grey skin and terrible wig and stuffed corset, and said that's the one I want without irony and without condition. She made it to her room. Sat on the floor with her back against the bed because the chair was too far and her legs had made it clear they were done performing structural integrity for the evening. The ash tin was on the dressing table. The wig on its stand. The beige gown on the hook. She looked at them for a long time. 4 years of armor and this man had walked past all of it and found her anyway. Not despite the disguise. Through it. As if the grey powder and the limp brown wig were, to him, simply weather, unpleasant, temporary, entirely irrelevant to the person sitting underneath. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her face against them. Oh, she thought. Oh, this is so much worse than I thought.
Right now, before we go any further, if this story has already got you feeling something, drop a comment below and tell me what you're thinking. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what's coming next will absolutely floor you. Share this with someone who loves a good romance, because trust me, it's about to get devastating.
Her uncle arrived on a Wednesday morning, which was not a Tuesday and therefore not protected by the particular buffer of good feeling that Tuesdays had recently started to provide. He came with 3 trunks, his London solicitor, and an expression Vivienne had not seen on his face since she was 14 and had accidentally published a piece that had nearly sparked a diplomatic incident between 2 countries she'd rather not name. Victor Voss was 63 years old, built like a man who had started life with very little and had built everything he owned with his own hands, which was exactly what he had done. He ran the most widely circulated newspaper between London and Vienna. He had silver at his temples and ink permanently at his knuckles, and he loved his niece with the uncomplicated ferocity of a man who had no children of his own. He took one look at her face when she opened the drawing room door, and a small smile broke out on his face. I never thought I'd ever actually see you in your disguise." Vivienne gave him a soft smile. "Good morning, Uncle. May I ask what brings you here?" Her uncle set down his hat. Before speaking, "They found the financier," he said. The drawing room went very cold. "How long?" she managed to finally say after a while. "Fenwick and Carraway have been working backward from the last article. They traced the publishing house to the London office. They traced the London office to my holding company." He Saturday. "They don't have your name. But they have the chain, and the chain ends at me, and I am considerably easier to find than an anonymous writer." She sat across from him. Her hands were still in her lap. "Hargrove," she said. 2 weeks, Vivienne. 3 if we are very careful." She thought about the folder on William's desk. The deed transfers. The financial architecture. She was so close. She could see the shape of the final piece, where it needed to go, what it needed to say, and 2 weeks was not enough time to build it alone. "I need more time," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her. The careful, unhurried look of a man about to say something he has been thinking about for longer than this conversation. "Tell the Duke." "No. Vivienne." "Absolutely not. His solicitor contacted me 18 months ago." He said it quietly, which was how he said the things that mattered most, not louder but softer, so you had to lean toward them. "Looking for financial records connected to Hargrove's parliamentary dealings. He has been building the same case you have been building. From the inside, from the money, from the architecture." He paused. "You have the human evidence, the witness accounts, the behavioral documentation, the stories of the women." She was very still. "He has the structure," her uncle continued. "The ledgers, the property transfers, the chain of corruption from the man at the top to the men at the bottom." He looked at her steadily. "Together it is irrefutable. Separately, in 2 weeks, it is nothing." She said nothing. Outside the window, 2 sparrows were fighting over something in the garden with loud and total commitment. "He'll know who I am," she said finally. "Yes," her uncle said. No softening. Just the plain truth of it, offered gently but without flinching. "He will." She stood. Walked to the window. Stood there with her back to her uncle and her hands clasped and the garden in front of her. 2 sparrows still fighting below. "And the house," she said quietly. The Tuesdays, and she stopped. She was not going to inventory it aloud. "If I tell him everything, he will know that every conversation in that library was had by a woman in a disguise. He will know that every time I was," she pressed her lips together, "every honest thing I gave him was given while wearing someone else's face." Her uncle was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think he will mind?" She turned from the window. Her uncle was looking at her with an expression that was very precisely not a smile but contained all the same components. "He looks at you, Vivienne," he said simply. "I have been in this house 40 minutes and I can see it from here." She opened her mouth, closed it, picked up her notebook from the side table and walked out of the drawing room without another word. She did not go to him immediately. That was not how Vivienne worked. She needed the edges of a thing before she could walk toward the center of it. She spent the afternoon with the documents. Spread them across her desk, cross-referenced them against her notes, mapped the gaps between what she had and what William had described in those careful, partial conversations where they'd each been sharing just enough to collaborate without fully revealing themselves. Like 2 people reading from the same book in different languages, describing the same story without realizing it. The more she looked, the clearer it became. Her uncle was right. She hated when her uncle was right. He was, annoyingly, right approximately 90% of the time, which was why she had trusted him with 4 years of her life's most dangerous work. She needed William. She needed to sit across the library desk from him and put everything on the table. Vivienne Ashby, the notebook, the 4 years, Clara, Hargrove, all of it, and trust that what came out the other side was still what she thought it was. The problem was that she had not trusted anyone with the full weight of herself in a very long time. She had built Maud specifically so she wouldn't have to. She sat at the desk until the light changed. Until the house went quiet around her. Until she heard, below, the familiar sound of the library fire being stoked by the evening footman. Then she picked up the Hargrove folder. Stood up. Walked to the door. Stopped. She looked at the mirror. At Maud's face looking back, grey, dull, unremarkable. Then at her own hands, the ink stain on her right knuckle, the faint mark the notebook edge had pressed into her palm. She did not remove the wig. Not yet. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she walked to the library with the folder in her hands and her real name sitting in her mouth like something she was about to say out loud for the first time in years. And when she pushed open the door and he looked up from his desk, and she saw his expression shift from the focused frown of a man at work to something quieter and more alert. She closed the door behind her. "How long," she said, "have you been investigating Lord Hargrove?" He set his pen down. 3 years, 4 months, he said, and approximately 11 days. The fire crackled. Neither of them moved. "Your solicitor contacted my uncle," she said. "Your uncle's solicitor contacted me first, actually." He leaned back. 18 months ago. The room rearranged itself in some fundamental way, not its furniture or its light, but the particular geometry of two people in it, shifting from parallel to convergent. "You know who I am," she said. "I know what you've written," he said carefully. "I know the detail from the Dunmore dinner that only one person in that room could have known. I counted the women there. I eliminated 3. He paused. "You are the only one whose account of that evening was unverifiable. And you said nothing." "No. Why?" He looked at her directly, the way he always did. No performance, no management, just the plain honest answer. "Because you were the only person doing what needed to be done. And because..." He stopped. Something moved across his face, the look of a man making a decision about how much truth to give. "I didn't want you to stop," he said. Vivienne held his gaze for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and placed the folder on his desk. "My name," she said, "is Vivienne Ashby, and I need you to show me everything you have." He looked at the folder. He looked at her. Then he opened his own desk drawer and slid a file across the surface that was 3 times the thickness of anything she'd produced, filled with 3 years of a different kind of fury, meticulously documented and waiting for someone to walk into the room with the other half. She opened it. By the second page, her hands had gone still. By the third, she understood exactly how deep the rot went. Not just Hargrove, not just the auction, but a network so embedded in the walls of Parliament that pulling it out would bring down pieces of the ceiling. "This is enough," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Together, what I have and what you have, this is enough to finish it." "I know," he said. He wasn't looking at the file. He was looking at her face, watching her read it, with an expression she couldn't fully see because she was too busy staring at the documents. "There's a masquerade," he said. "End of season. Hargrove's house. The original deed transfers will be there. I know because his archivist is one of my sources. The documents that prove direct parliamentary interference. I can't access the private study. Every man in that room knows my face." She looked up. "But no one," he said, "knows yours." The fire between them burned low. "When?" she said. 3 weeks. She thought about her uncle in the drawing room. 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if we are very careful. She thought about Fenwick and Carraway and the chain of evidence pointing at Victor Voss's holding company. She thought about Clara, who had stopped writing letters. "I'll go," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Relief, yes, but underneath it something that had been braced and was now, carefully, letting go. He nodded once. She picked up his folder. He picked up hers. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours, cross-referencing, mapping, building the final shape of something that had been 4 years and 3 years and 11 days in the making. And it was only when the clock struck midnight and she looked up and found him watching her, pen idle, that she realized she had not once, in all of it, remembered to hunch her shoulders. She straightened them instead. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "I'll have the fire built up," he said. She stood. Walked to the door. Stopped with her hand on the frame. "William," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the candle. The one you left when I fell asleep." A beat. Then his expression did something quiet and unguarded that he didn't quite manage to put away before she saw it. "Good night, Vivienne," he said. Her name in his voice. She walked upstairs to her room and sat at the dressing table and looked at the wig on its stand and the ash tin beside it and the woman underneath all of it in the mirror. In 3 weeks she would walk into Hargrove's house as herself. Her real face. her real name. And when she came back out, everything would be different. She looked at her amber eyes in the glass for a long time. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write the first line of the final article. Downstairs, she could hear him still in the library. Neither of them slept much that night. 3 weeks passed away, the last 3 weeks before something irreversible always pass, simultaneously too fast and with the specific cruelty of each individual day stretching long. They worked. That was what the 3 weeks were, underneath everything else. 2 people dismantling a decade of carefully constructed rot, document by document, late into nights that neither of them named as anything other than work. But there was a different quality to the library now. Something had shifted the evening she'd walked in with the Hargrove folder and said her real name out loud, and neither of them had tried to shift it back. He called her Vivienne. Always. Without ceremony, as though it had always been the word. She noticed every single time. She also noticed that he'd stopped pretending to read when she was talking. That he'd started leaving a glass of water on her side of the desk without being asked because she forgot to drink when she was deep in something. That once, when she'd made a connection between 2 documents that cracked the whole architecture open, a link between Hargrove's property transfers and 3 specific parliamentary votes that proved intention rather than coincidence, he had looked at her with an expression so unguarded that she'd had to look back at the documents immediately, because the alternative was doing something she wasn't ready for. The night before the masquerade, she couldn't eat. She sat at dinner and moved food around her plate, and William said nothing about it for 20 minutes. Then, without looking up from his own plate, "It's going to work. You don't know that. I know you've been in that room a dozen times without anyone seeing you." "That was Maud," she said. "Tomorrow I'll be..." She stopped. "Yourself," he said. He looked up then. "Which is considerably more formidable." She looked at him across the table. The candlelight between them. The water glass he'd poured without being asked. "What if someone recognizes me?" she said. "Not as the writer. Just, I've sat beside these men. I've been in these rooms. If any of them look closely enough, then I'll be next to you," he said simply. "And we'll leave." She sat with that for a moment. The uncomplicated solidity of it. "You make it sound easy," she said. "It isn't easy," he said. "But it's possible. There's a difference." He picked up his glass. "And you have never once, in 4 years, let possible become impossible. I've read the evidence." She looked down at her plate. "Eat something," he said, and went back to his dinner, and she picked up a fork because there was nothing else to do when someone knew you well enough to say exactly the right thing and made absolutely nothing of it. The morning of the masquerade, she sent her uncle a letter with 4 words, "Tonight. Don't wait up." Then she sat at the dressing table and looked at the wig for a long time. She had worn it for 4 years. She had put it on so many times that her hands moved automatically. Pin here, press there, and the transformation had become thoughtless, mechanical, the way you stop tasting food you eat every day. She had not thought about what was under it in a very long time because thinking about it required thinking about the girl who'd decided to disappear, and that girl's reasons, and Clara Hartley's face the last time she'd seen it. She picked up the wig. Set it back down. Picked up the ash tin. Closed it. Looked at herself. Her actual self, auburn hair unpinned, pale skin without the grey, amber eyes unobstructed. The face she'd been folding away in a drawer for 4 years, pulling out occasionally in private to check it was still there. It was still there. She looked tired, she thought. And something else. Something that had not been there 4 years ago, some quality in the set of her jaw and the directness of her eyes that had not come from privilege or ease but from a very long time of doing hard things anyway. She pinned her hair. Put on the blue gown. Picked up the bag with the notebook. Opened the door. He was in the corridor, hand raised to knock. The moment stretched. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've been building a picture of in your mind from fragments and partial information. And the picture was close but not complete, and now the last piece has arrived and the whole thing resolves. Not shock. Not performance. Just a man seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, and finding that what he saw exceeded everything he'd quietly prepared himself to feel. He composed himself. She watched him try and almost succeed and not quite manage it, and she found, absurdly, that the almost was what undid her, not the reaction but the effort, the proof that he was not performing composure but actually reaching for it, because she had done something to the composure of William Cavendish that he hadn't fully accounted for. "You're shaking," he said. Quietly. She looked at her hands. She was, faintly. "Do you need an exit," he said, "or do you need a partner?" She looked up at him. All of him. The golden hair and the dark eyes, and 4 weeks of candles left burning, and armchairs moved 6 inches, and arguments lost gracefully, and "I don't want a different woman" said through a 3-inch gap in a study door. She took his arm. "Partner," she said. Hargrove's house was everything the Ton built when it wanted to feel clean. Marble floors, towering arrangements of white flowers, music designed to make the air feel like something other than what it was. She had been inside it once before, as Maud, invisible in the corner, watching the man himself work a room with the practiced warmth of someone who had long ago mastered the art of being liked. Tonight she walked in as Vivienne Ashby, and the difference was not what she expected. She had expected to feel exposed. Raw. The specific vulnerability of a person who has removed their armor in a room full of people who sharpen themselves on weakness. Instead she felt present. Solidly, entirely in her body in a way she hadn't been in 4 years. Like she had been watching the world through a window and had finally, without quite deciding to, stepped through it. The room noticed her. She let it. 3 women sought introduction within the first 20 minutes. 2 men she had sat beside at the auction, men who had looked through Maud Greywell like glass, who had leaned across her to speak to someone more worthwhile, were suddenly, inexplicably, interested in being in her orbit. She smiled at them with a warmth she did not feel and noted their names in the back of her mind for future reference. William stayed at the edge of her vision. Always there, never crowding, a fixed point she could orient by without needing to look directly at. When the room shifted and Hargrove moved toward the grand staircase surrounded by 3 parliamentary allies, she felt William's hand at the small of her back, brief, warm, there and then not there, and she looked up to find him already moving toward Hargrove with his hand extended, the social machinery of a duke at full elegant efficiency. Hargrove, just the man. "There's something in the Bexley Amendment I need your particular expertise on." She moved. The private study was on the 2nd floor, 3rd door left from the landing. She knew because she'd memorized the architectural plans Victor's contact had acquired 3 days ago. She walked there without hurrying, without looking over her shoulder, the way people move through spaces they belong in. The lock took 40 seconds. She'd practiced with a similar mechanism for 2 evenings running, William timing her with his watch from across the library desk with an expression of concentrated neutrality that suggested he was choosing not to have feelings about the fact that his houseguest could pick locks. Inside, dark. Desk. Filing cabinet, left side, 2nd drawer. The documents were there. She knew them on sight. She'd been told what to look for by a man who had built a 3-year case around their existence. Original deed transfers, 12 of them, with Hargrove's signature and parliamentary letterhead and dates that placed him exactly where he'd sworn under oath he had never been. She put them in the bag with the notebook. She was back in the ballroom in 15 minutes, a glass of champagne in her hand, speaking to a perfectly pleasant woman about the unreasonable cost of hothouse flowers, when William found her with his eyes across the room. He was still with Hargrove. The conversation was ongoing. But his eyes found hers over the man's shoulder and she held his gaze for 1 second and let him read her face. Done. Something moved through his expression, the relief of it, and then past the relief, like a door opening onto something that had been waiting behind it, and he wrapped up the conversation with Hargrove with 3 sentences and crossed the room without appearing to hurry and said, close to her ear, "Shall we leave?" "Immediately," she said. 3 streets from Hargrove's house, the carriage hit a particular patch of cobblestone, and the jolt was enough to make her start laughing. It came out of her without permission, the real laugh, the full one, the one she'd been keeping behind Maud's eyes for 4 years, the slightly unhinged laughter of a person who has been holding their breath for so long that the exhale sounds like something breaking open. She pressed her hand over her mouth and it came through anyway, and when she looked across the carriage at him she found him watching her with an expression that had given up entirely on being composed. "We have it," she managed. "We have it," he said. "For years," she said. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days for me, he said. But I wasn't counting. She laughed again, softer, and when it settled something quieter moved in behind it. She looked at him in the moving lamplight. He looked back. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Vivienne, you don't." "William." He stopped. She looked at her hands. The ink stain on her right knuckle. The notebook bag in her lap. "Every midnight in that library," she said. "Every argument. Every time you moved something or left something or said something so honest it knocked the breath out of me." She paused. I forgot every single time to be anyone other than who I actually am. Not because I stopped being careful. Because you made it. She stopped. Tried again. You made being myself easier than being Maud. And that had never happened before. Not once. Not with anyone. He was very still. So every honest thing I gave you, she continued, was real. It was Vivienne, not a character, not the cover. The woman who fell asleep in your library and woke with a blanket over her, that was me. All of it was me. She finally looked up. I needed you to know that. Because you deserve to know what was real. The wheels on the cobblestones. The lamplight coming and going. I know, he said. You. I know, quieter. Vivienne. Did you think I couldn't tell? I read 6 years of your thinking before I sat across a table from you. I knew how your mind moved, what made it stop, what made it run. Maud was the grey and the wig. You were always there. A pause, something stripped entirely of management. I was always talking to you. She had no answer. He reached into his coat, produced a folded paper, held it out across the carriage. She took it, unfolded it. His handwriting. The same number, that obscene, £5,000 room-stopping number from the night that changed everything. And beneath it, added in fresh ink, 4 words. Same offer. Real name. She stared at it for a long moment. Something was happening in her chest that she'd stopped trying to manage somewhere around the 3rd Tuesday midnight and had simply been living with since. That's an auction bid, she said. Not a proposal. You're right, he said. I can do better. He moved from his seat across the carriage to sit beside her, and the space closed between them, and she was suddenly very aware of the smallness of carriages and the largeness of moments. He took her hand. Looked at it first, the ink stain, the notebook mark pressed into her palm, and ran his thumb across it once, like a man reading something he's been learning the language of for months. Then he looked at her. Vivienne Ashby, he said. You are the only person who has beaten me in an argument and made me grateful for it. You are the only person I've wanted to still be talking to when the candles run out. His voice dropped slightly. I have spent 3 years building a case in the dark and 4 months understanding why it was worth building. And I would like very much, if you'll allow it, to stop working in parallel and simply be in the same room for the rest of my life. She looked at him. The golden hair and the dark eyes, and the man who had walked into an auction hall on a Friday evening and bid £5,000 not to own her but to make sure she made it out of the room. That's still not a proper proposal, she said, because she was Vivienne and she could not simply receive a thing without testing its edges first. Something in his face shifted, the private smile, the real one, small and entirely unperformed. Marry me, he said. Write whatever you want. Argue with me every Tuesday for the rest of our lives. Bring your uncle to every dinner. I've come to enjoy being lectured in 2 languages. Just, quieter now, down to the bone of it. Let me be the person who knows where you are. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a girl of 23 in a lodging house mirror rubbing ash into her cheeks, furious and frightened and absolutely certain she would do this alone. She thought about Clara, who had stopped writing letters. She thought about 12 locked doors she'd opened herself and one she hadn't known she was standing in front of until it was already open. Yes, she said. He exhaled, and she felt it, the specific release of someone who had been carefully, privately hoping, and had not been certain, and was now certain. And then his hand came up and he held her face with both hands and kissed her, and it was not the practiced performance of a man accustomed to making impressions but something far more devastating, honest, unhurried, entirely real. When she pulled back she found him looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor, complete, resolved, the last piece of something finally in place. The sapphire, he said quietly. What? He reached back into his coat. His coat had apparently become a repository for the most important objects in her immediate future, and produced a small box. Opened it. The ring was not ostentatious. It was not designed for a room. It was a deep sapphire, the color of deep water, set simply in gold, and it looked exactly like something chosen for a specific woman rather than for a general impression of choosing well. She held out her hand. He put it on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then at him. The color, she said. The gown, he confirmed. From tonight. I had it commissioned 2 weeks ago. She stared at him. You were that certain? "No," he said. "I was that hopeful. There's a difference." He paused. "I've learned to distinguish them." The carriage slowed. Ashford House rose above them through the window, dark-windowed and settled. The house she had walked into as Maud Greywell and would walk back into as Vivienne Ashby, and those were not different women but the same woman, finally the same woman, carrying all 4 years of herself in one body. She looked at the ring one more time. Then she looked at him, and something she'd been braced against since she was 19, the particular exhaustion of doing everything alone, of building walls out of ash and cheap wigs because the world hadn't offered a better option, quietly, finally, put itself down. "Take me home," she said. He stepped out of the carriage and offered his hand for the third time since the night they met. She took it for the third time. She did not let go. The article published on a Thursday. It was the longest piece Vivienne had ever written and the most meticulously sourced, and by Friday morning 3 of the 17 named men had already sent intermediaries discussing terms. By the following week, the auction, that gilded, chandelier-lit machinery of control, closed its doors without ceremony or announcement, the way corrupt things always end, not with confrontation but with the sudden absence of anyone willing to stand behind them. Her uncle read the final piece over breakfast in William's dining room and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have been furious." "I know," Vivienne said. Furious and unbearably proud. She looked at her tea. "I know," she said again, more quietly. Across the table, William refilled her cup without being asked. Their eyes met briefly over it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. 3 months later, in the library, she was in the good armchair, still hers, still moved 6 inches to the left, still perfectly angled, when he came in and sat across from her and slid something across the table without preamble. It was a copy of that morning's paper, open to page 4, the column that had been anonymous for 4 years. At the bottom, for the first time, a name. Vivienne Cavendish, Duchess of Ashford. She looked at it for a long moment. "You don't have to," he said. "It can stay anonymous. It can stay Maud. Whatever you want." She thought about a lodging house mirror and ash on her fingertips and 4 years of invisible fury printed in 50,000 copies across England. She thought about Clara Hartley, who had written her a letter last month, the first letter in 3 years, from a house in the country, in her own name, saying only, "I read your article. I read all of them. I knew it was you." She looked at the name in print. Vivienne Cavendish, Duchess of Ashford. Not hiding. Not invisible. Not Maud. Just herself, in ink, permanent. "It's exactly what I want," she said. He looked at her across the Voltaire still spine up on the side table, across 4 years and 3 years and 11 days and 1 Tuesday midnight that had changed everything without either of them deciding it would, and his expression was the private one, the real one, small and unpolished and entirely given to her. She picked up her pen. And she started writing. Outside, London continued its indifferent noise. Somewhere, 17 men were having a significantly worse year than they had planned. Somewhere, her uncle was expanding the newspaper into a third country and claiming it was for business reasons and not at all because it gave him an excuse to visit more often. In the library of Ashford House, with the garden window light falling across the page, there was just this: 2 people who had spent years circling the same darkness from opposite directions, finding out that the person standing on the other side of it was exactly who they'd needed all along. No disguise. No ash. No performance. Just the truth, which was, she had discovered, the only thing worth writing. And the only thing, in the end, that had ever set her free.
And that is the end of Vivienne and William's story. But only if you let it be. If this story moved you, if you felt every single moment of it, then do something about it right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me which scene absolutely wrecked you, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Share this with someone who needs a story that reminds them that being fully seen is not something to run from. It is everything worth waiting for. We'll see you in the next one.